Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It started with my mother's voice echoing down the hallway, shrill and sharp enough to cut through bone, and when I think about it now, it wasn't just her words that stung. It was how quickly she went from pretending to love me to treating me like a parasite in front of everyone. "You're 27, you still don't have a real job, you sleep in until noon, and you suck the energy out of this house like a damn leech," she yelled, hands trembling as she pointed toward the door like I was a dog that had just pissed on her rug. I didn't argue. I'd tried that already too many times. I'd tried being quiet, helpful, invisible, obedient. I'd tried getting jobs that didn't last because they either dried up, closed down, or weren't enough to stop my brother from sneering every time I came into the room. And now, there he was, Matt, standing with his arms folded and that smug smirk that always made me want to break something. He didn't say much, didn't need to, because he had Tracy clinging to him like a barnacle, whispering into his ear and eyeing me like I was something she'd found growing in the fridge. "You heard Mom," Matt said eventually, cold as the beer he always had in his hand. "Get out of here and find a new place for yourself. You've overstayed your welcome." They'd packed a black trash bag with some of my stuff, socks, shirts, half a pair of headphones, and a deodorant stick I hadn't used in 2 days because I'd been too depressed to shower. No suitcase, no cash, not even my phone charger. Just that cheap plastic bag tossed at my feet like I was garbage too. I looked at my mom one last time, hoping maybe there'd be some flicker of regret or hesitation, but all I saw was exhaustion mixed with disgust. The kind of look you give a stain on the floor. I left. I walked 5 blocks to a friend's place I hadn't seen since high school, stayed there for 3 nights until her boyfriend started complaining. After that, it was park benches, then church basements, then a few nights on the floor of a stranger's apartment after I answered a Craigslist ad asking for someone to help clean out a flooded storage unit. I wasn't picky. I couldn't afford to be. The next few months blurred together into a haze of odd jobs, sore feet, missed meals, and a constant knot in my stomach that never really went away. I washed dishes in diners. I hauled trash at construction sites. I folded clothes in a thrift shop until the owner realized I didn't have a mailing address and stopped calling me back. I spent Christmas sleeping behind a strip mall, wrapped in a donated blanket that still smelled like someone else's perfume. I remember New Year's Eve more clearly because I watched people in coats and heels count down on a TV inside a bar I wasn't allowed to enter, and for a second, I imagined they were cheering for me, cheering because I had survived another year that should have swallowed me whole. Winter almost got me. There were nights when I genuinely thought I wouldn't wake up. I'd wrap myself in 3 layers of clothes and curl against the wall of the shelter, hoping no one would steal my shoes in the night. I got good at looking harmless. I got better at looking invisible. Some days I would sit outside of bus stops with a cardboard sign I didn't want to hold, hoping someone might give me enough for a hot coffee or a breakfast sandwich. Some people looked through me. Others looked at me like they wished I would disappear. And through it all, I kept thinking about my dad. He died 2 years before they kicked me out, and I always knew, that if he were still alive, none of this would have happened. He wasn't perfect, but he listened. He asked questions. He paid attention when no one else did. After his funeral, something shifted in the house. Joanne, my mother, became colder, angrier, more bitter about the bills, the housework, and my presence. Matt, who'd barely visited when Dad was alive, suddenly started showing up more, always with a new story about how he was the only one responsible enough to handle the estate, always whispering with Mom behind closed doors. I asked to see the will once. They told me it had been taken care of. I wasn't allowed to see it. Still, deep down, I never let go of the feeling that something had gone wrong, something bigger than their cruelty, something hidden. But I didn't have the power to do anything about it. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't even have a bed. Until one rainy Tuesday morning, everything changed. It was early, just after sunrise, and I was sitting at a bus stop near the old industrial part of town, soaked from the knees down and sipping a cup of black coffee that had gone cold 15 minutes after I bought it. I was staring at a dented soda can in the gutter, wondering whether I could sell it for 5 cents, when a patrol car pulled up across the street. I didn't flinch at first, I hadn't done anything wrong. Then 2 officers stepped out. Not fast, not aggressive. One of them held a clipboard. The other just walked over slowly, hands tucked into his jacket like he didn't want to scare me. "You Alex Morgan?" he asked, squinting against the rain. I nodded slowly, unsure whether I should lie. "We've been looking for you," he said. "For a year." And I swear, for a full 5 seconds, I forgot how to breathe. I sat in the back of that patrol car trying to make sense of what the hell was happening, watching the city roll past in streaks of rain through the fogged-up window, and for the first time in almost a year. I wasn't thinking about where I'd sleep that night or whether I could stretch $5 into 2 days of food. Instead, I was wondering why 2 police officers had walked up to me without cuffs, with calm voices, and told me they'd been looking for me for a year. That didn't make sense. No one had been looking for me. Not when I got kicked out, not when I slept behind dumpsters or scraped gum off movie theater seats for food money. For a full year, the only thing that ever found me was more bad luck. They didn't take me to a police station, not really. It was a quiet building downtown, tucked behind a city office complex, with a lobby that smelled like fresh paint and tired desperation. They led me into a small room with a table, 2 chairs, and a vending machine humming outside the door like white noise. Then they left, and after about 15 minutes of waiting with nothing but a buzzing fluorescent light and my own confusion, a man in a wrinkled gray suit walked in, holding a file that looked like it weighed more than I did. He introduced himself as Detective Reyes, and his voice was calm in the way that makes you nervous, like he'd already seen more than he was going to say. He didn't start with small talk, didn't ask how I was or if I needed coffee. He just slid the file onto the table, opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab, and said, "You're Alex Morgan, child of James Morgan, correct?" I nodded, my throat dry, unsure if I was walking into a trap or waking up from a bad dream. He said, "I'm not here to charge you with anything. I'm here because of your father's estate." For a second, I couldn't respond. My dad had been gone for over 2 years, and I hadn't heard a single word about his will or his estate since the day they buried him in a plot my mother insisted be simple and budget-conscious. That day, I'd asked if there was something he'd left behind for me, and Joanne had looked at me like I'd asked if I could dig him up and check. "There's nothing for you," she'd said. "He left things the way he wanted." And Matt, always eager to twist the knife, had added, "It's not like he had anything to leave anyway." But apparently, that was a lie. Detective Reyes explained that over the past year, while sorting through legal documents tied to a fraud investigation involving my brother's recent real estate deals, a red flag popped up. One of the documents bore a forged signature, my father's name, dated a week before his death, and it didn't match the version of the will that had been filed in probate court. When investigators dug deeper, they found discrepancies. My name had originally been listed as the sole trustee of a living trust tied to several properties, investments, and a bank account with more zeros than I'd ever seen in real life. But after my father's death, a new will was submitted that removed me entirely. That second version, the one that Matt and my mother swore by, was now under criminal review. I blinked, stunned, and said the first thing that came to my mind, "That doesn't make sense. They kicked me out 8 months before the will was changed." Reyes paused, then raised an eyebrow and corrected me gently. "You mean 12 months ago, right?" I stopped. Something didn't line up. I could have sworn it had only been 8 months since that trash bag of clothes hit the porch. I remembered the weather, the clothes I had on, the way Matt's face looked when he said the words like he'd been rehearsing. But now I couldn't tell if my memory was lying or if someone else had shifted the truth. Reyes leaned forward and said, "Your father left a video. It was recorded about a week before he passed. We only found it last month, tucked away in a separate file linked to his estate. No one outside of a small legal team has seen it. Not your mother. Not your brother. Not anyone." I looked at him, the reality crashing down harder than anything that came before. All the months I spent scraping by, barely surviving, while they lived comfortably under a roof that might have been mine to begin with. while they used my father's death like a get-rich-quick scheme and tossed me aside like old furniture. What did he say in the video? I asked. Reyes didn't answer. He stood up, walked to the door, and said, "We're going to play it for you now. But I need you to be ready, because once you hear what's in it, nothing about your family will ever feel the same again." And as he opened the door, I realized that everything I thought I knew about what happened, why they turned on me, why they shut me out, was about to be ripped open like an old wound. And this time, I wasn't sure how deep it went. When the screen flickered to life in that dim, windowless room, I don't know what I expected to see. Maybe a few stiff words from my father, a simple reading of legal instructions, or something clinical and detached, like most of the things left behind by the dead usually are. But the moment his face appeared, tired and sunken, slouched in an armchair I hadn't seen since I was a kid, I felt something crack under my ribs that hadn't moved in months. He looked older than I remembered, not just physically, but spiritually, like whatever had happened between his diagnosis and his death had pulled every drop of strength out of him and replaced it with quiet urgency. He took a deep breath and looked directly into the camera like he was talking to me across time, across pain, across the space that had opened between us since the last time I saw him. "Alex," he began, voice already trembling, "if you're seeing this, it means they did exactly what I thought they would." I don't think I even realized I was holding my breath until that sentence ended, and I felt my shoulders finally drop. He knew. He knew before it happened. My father had looked at Joanne, Matt, and Tracy and seen not a family, but a ticking time bomb with my name scribbled all over it. He went on to explain everything, how he'd tried to keep the peace between us all, how he knew Joanne had never forgiven me for siding with him during their final years of marriage, how Matt had always resented that I got more of his time when we were kids, even though I never got more of his money. He admitted he'd been warned by more than one friend to hide his assets, to separate the trust from the will, and to avoid putting all his faith in blood ties, but he couldn't bring himself to believe that they'd actually betray me. Still, just in case, he made a copy of the will, stored it through a third-party law firm, and filmed this message so there would be no doubt left behind. Tears were sliding down his face by the second minute, and by the fifth, I wasn't crying, I was frozen. Not out of shock anymore, but from the realization that this wasn't some tragic accident or careless oversight. My own family, my flesh and blood, had gone out of their way to erase me from my father's life after he died, not because they didn't know my worth, but because they were terrified of how much power he had left in my name. In the video, he detailed the trust in my name, accounts, properties, investment portfolios, and even a small cabin upstate that I hadn't visited since I was 15. It had all been designated to me. Sole heir. No conditions. No division. But after he passed, Matt and Tracy had presented a falsified will, submitted through a legal contact they claimed to know through a friend of the family. They filed a missing person report to the local court stating I had left town under mental duress, and Joanne signed a notarized affidavit claiming I had not returned their calls or been seen in months. Meanwhile, I was sleeping behind grocery stores, begging for day labor work, wondering if I'd ever get my dignity back. Detective Reyes paused the video, letting the screen fade to black, and then opened another folder, this one full of evidence. There were email chains, fake signatures that didn't match mine or my father's, bank statements showing money pulled from the trust and spent on luxury cars, a backyard pool renovation, and several wellness retreats. That cost more than I'd made in 10 years combined. I saw Tracy's name listed on the charge for a spa in Sedona and Matt's name beside a deposit slip for a vacation home I didn't even know they owned. They had stolen everything. And the most disgusting part? They had done it with calm, rehearsed smiles, all while pretending I was the crazy one for not calling home anymore. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even after the full weight of it hit me. Because grief had already emptied me out a long time ago, and what I felt now wasn't sadness, it was precision. Like all the jagged pieces of me were finally snapping together, not to make something whole, but something sharp. I looked at Detective Reyes and said the only thing I could think to say. They really thought I'd never come back, didn't they? He nodded, slow and quiet. They bet everything on you disappearing. Well, I said, smiling now, smiling for the first time in months and meaning it, bad bet. He slid a set of papers across the table, legal filings prepared by the original firm holding my father's trust. All I had to do was sign them, and the house, the assets, and every last shred of stolen inheritance would be back under my control. There were also additional forms, requests to press charges, initiate fraud investigations, open probate court review, and more. My name was on the top line of each document, clear and permanent. As I picked up the pen, I thought about every night I spent praying for a warm place to sleep, every time I swallowed my pride and asked for help from strangers, and every time I told myself I was worthless because of the lies someone else told. I signed them one by one, slow and steady, and when the last page was done, I looked up and said, "They're not going to see this coming." And I meant it. Because they had built a castle on quicksand, never thinking I'd find the map back home. But I had. And I was about to burn the drawbridge. The sky was gray and spitting rain when I stepped out of the black sedan that pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, but for the first time in a year, I didn't flinch at the weather because there was something poetic about it. About walking back into the house they threw me out of while the sky wept like it was mourning who I used to be. I wasn't alone, of course. 2 uniformed officers stepped out behind me, along with a sharply dressed woman in a navy blue blazer who introduced herself to everyone as the estate attorney representing the Morgan Trust, though she didn't need to say my last name for the people inside to understand exactly why we were there. Joanne opened the door, and for a half-second, I saw her face shift through 1,000 shades of denial, confusion, irritation, disbelief, and finally, that pale, stretched look of fear that only comes when someone realizes the hammer they thought they dodged is still swinging and now heading straight for their neck. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Matt was behind her, holding a cup of coffee like it might shield him from the consequences that were now piling up at his front door, and Tracy, wearing some designer robe and a full face of makeup like she'd just stepped off a reality show set, looked between us all like she still thought this was some kind of prank or maybe a poorly timed intervention. The attorney was the one who spoke first. Calm, professional, and with enough bite in her tone to make the silence inside the house turn brittle. She handed Joanne the envelope with the court order attached to it and announced, as matter-of-factly as if she were reading a dinner menu, that the house and all assets tied to the James Morgan Trust were now legally under my control and that any attempt to resist this order would be considered interference with an active fraud investigation. That word, fraud, seemed to finally land, because Matt dropped his mug on the floor, and the crack of ceramic on tile was the first honest sound any of them had made since I arrived. Tracy, as expected, tried to play innocent first. She started with a confused chuckle, then slipped into that familiar performative outrage. "This has to be some mistake," she said, stepping forward like she was going to reach for my hand or maybe just try to read my face for weakness. "Alex, come on. You haven't been around. We didn't know what to do. We thought you left for good." But her voice broke near the end, and I could see her eyes darting to the attorney, to the officers, and finally back to me, and what she saw was not someone who was going to forgive and forget, but someone who'd spent a year surviving off rage and frozen sandwiches. Matt tried a different tactic. He moved into the hallway, pacing like a man trying to count the exits. "Look, Alex," he said, "this whole thing got blown out of proportion, okay? We didn't mean for it to go this far." I raised an eyebrow at him, then pulled out a copy of the email thread where he and Tracy coordinated bank withdrawals using my father's forged signature. "How far did you mean for it to go?" I asked, voice calm, but loud enough to echo in the bones of the house. And Joanne, dear, cold, calculating Joanne, said nothing. She just stood there, hands gripping the back of a kitchen chair, her eyes wet but her expression dry as ever. She looked like a woman who had just realized she bet everything on the wrong child and lost spectacularly. Her lips parted once, maybe to apologize, maybe to spit more poison, but I beat her to it. "I'm not here for your tears," I said, stepping into the living room like it never stopped being mine. "I'm here to take back what should have never been stolen." I let the officers handle the rest. They delivered the paperwork, photographed the house interior, made copies of the safe contents, and instructed them all to vacate the property within 72 hours. Matt tried to protest until the attorney reminded him that criminal charges for forgery, theft, and elder financial abuse were already pending and that any delay would only make things worse. But I wasn't done yet, not until I saw their faces when I handed over the final document, the one that outlined what I had chosen to do with the trust. I didn't want the money. I didn't want the house. Not like that. So I took every last dollar and transferred it into a nonprofit in my father's name, a foundation that would fund shelters, transitional housing programs, and job training initiatives for people exactly like the version of me they tried to erase. Every cent Tracy thought she'd use for a luxury renovation? Gone. Every dime Matt tried to bury in shell companies? Recovered and redirected. Every security blanket Joanne thought she had knitted from the ashes of my life? Torched. She cried then, for real this time. Big, heaving sobs that shook her shoulders as she begged for understanding, for mercy, for a second chance at the kind of motherhood she'd long since abandoned. And I just stood there, still as stone, watching her unravel with all the emotion of someone who had finally run out of things to feel. Save it, I said, walking past her, up the stairs to my old room, where I stood for a moment in the doorway just taking in the smell of dust and old paint. You taught me everything I needed to know about indifference. I'm just finally putting it to use. I walked back down as the attorney locked up the documents in her briefcase, and the officers prepared their exit. It was almost over. Almost. My phone buzzed as we stepped outside. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, maybe out of habit or maybe because my gut knew this story still had one more chapter. Alex, came the crackling voice of Mrs. Elkins, the neighbor who used to bring over cookies and gossip when I was little. I've been meaning to call you. There's something else I need to tell you. Your father, he had a second will. One no one ever found. And just like that, everything I thought was finished was wide open again. The next morning was colder than it had any right to be for that time of year, the kind of cold that sits just beneath your clothes and makes your skin feel thin, like everything underneath is too close to the surface. I wrapped my coat tighter as I walked the few blocks to Mrs. Elkins' house, a place I hadn't set foot inside since I was maybe 14. Back when she used to sneak me peanut brittle and tell me about the neighborhood drama in the way only someone who had lived in the same zip code since 1963 could. She was already standing in the doorway when I got there, holding a cup of tea in one hand and a look on her face that made me nervous before she even said a word. We didn't waste time. She led me up to her attic, her joints creaking almost as much as the wooden steps beneath our feet, and pointed to a corner behind an old cedar chest stacked with blankets that hadn't seen daylight in decades. He gave it to me the week before he went into the hospital, she said, tapping the edge of a dusty box with a trembling hand. Told me not to mention it unless things went the way he feared. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just picked up the box, heavier than I expected, and carried it down to her kitchen, where I cleared a space on the table and carefully peeled the lid off like it might explode if I moved too fast. Inside was a plain manila envelope, unsealed but tied with a red ribbon like something out of an old movie. Beneath it was a smaller wooden box, the kind that looked handmade, carved initials on top that read JM. I opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter, written in my father's handwriting. Neat, deliberate, unmistakable. The first few lines were ordinary, soft words about family, regrets about time, apologies for not being better at expressing himself. But then, somewhere around the fourth paragraph, the tone shifted. He started talking about Matt, about Joanne, about the mistakes that had followed him like shadows he could never outrun. Matt wasn't his biological son. That sentence alone nearly stopped my heart, even though I think a part of me had always known it, or at least suspected it during the quiet moments when their relationship never quite looked like father and son, but more like reluctant obligation. My father wrote about how Joanne had gotten pregnant during a rough patch early in their marriage, how she swore it was his, how he accepted it at first because what else could he do, but the doubts never went away. He wrote about how he confronted her years later, how she confessed during an argument, and then used that truth as leverage every time she wanted something. "If you tell him, I'll leave," she'd say. "If you change the will, I'll destroy you." And so, to keep peace, or at least the illusion of it, he compromised. The will I had overturned, the one that listed me and Matt together, was written out of guilt. Guilt for letting me be pushed aside. Guilt for letting Matt believe he had something that was never his. Guilt for letting Joe and manipulate the last few years of his life into something he barely recognized. But the will in my hands, the one wrapped in red ribbon and dated just 10 days before his hospitalization, was different. It named me as sole heir. Not just to the trust, but to the entirety of his estate, personal and professional. It acknowledged the truth. It was clear, final, and signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, Mrs. Elkins included. I stared at the signature, my hands shaking not from shock, but from the quiet, soul-deep confirmation that I had never been crazy. That I had never been wrong for feeling what I felt all those years. That I wasn't imagining the distance, the dismissal, the cruelty. It had all been real. And now I had proof in my hands. With that new will, everything changed. I brought the documents back to the estate attorney, who nearly dropped her coffee when she saw the dates and witness signatures. The next steps were immediate. A motion filed to reopen the probate case, new charges considered, and an emergency hearing set for the following week. The courtroom was smaller than you'd expect for a moment this big, but the tension inside could have split the walls in 2. Joanne showed up in black, like she was mourning the end of a legacy that never really belonged to her. Matt looked hollow, eyes darting around like he could still lawyer his way out of this, and Tracy, well, Tracy just looked bored, as if someone had dragged her out of brunch to watch the house of cards collapse. The judge listened, read the new documents, reviewed the signatures, and asked only a few questions before it became very clear that no amount of legal wriggling was going to change the outcome. Joanne broke first. It happened during questioning, when my attorney asked her directly if she'd known the truth about Matt's paternity and the forged documents. She held it together for maybe a minute, insisting she wasn't sure and couldn't remember, but when pressed about the missing files and the altered will, her composure cracked like old plaster. "Fine," she finally shouted, voice raw. "Yes, I knew. I did it because he was too weak to do what needed to be done." The room fell silent. The judge leaned forward. "You admit to falsifying legal documents tied to the estate of James Morgan?" She blinked, suddenly aware of what she'd said, but it was too late. It was over. I didn't say a word during her breakdown. I didn't look at Matt when he turned to me with wide eyes, desperate to find the brother I used to be. I didn't spare Tracy even half a glance. I stood, calm and quiet, and walked out of the courtroom like I was walking out of a grave I'd been buried in for years. Outside, the wind had picked up, cold and cutting, but it felt different now. Like a baptism. I reached into my coat and pulled out the letter, the one my father wrote with his whole truth etched into every word, and I held it in my hand for a moment before slipping it back into my pocket. I wasn't just finding a new place to live. I was finding out who I really was. And maybe, I'm still not done.